We're turning our attention now to ethics reform. Governor Cuomo made the issue a key plank in his 2010 campaign, promising to clean up Albany upon arriving at the Capitol. Now, the governor and lawmakers have really had their hands full with the budget, but some behind-the-scenes talks are taking place on strengthening the state's ethics laws, particularly when it comes to the disclosure of outside income by moonlighting lawmakers. Speaker Sheldon Silver is reportedly playing ball with the governor, while Senate Minority Leader John Sampson today accused Majority Leader Dean Skelos of backtracking on his election year reform promises. It's all very confusing. So here to catch us up on the latest reform efforts is Blair Horner. He is the legislative director of NYPIRG, and he is, of course, one of the state's leading good government advocates. Thanks for your time tonight, Blair.
Well, thanks for having me, Liz.
So a lot of this is taking place behind the scenes, which is a little bit flies in the face of the whole transparency pledge that the governor intoned during the campaign. But what is it that you're hearing on the ground?
Well, it's always hard to know for sure until you actually start seeing bill language, which we have not. But it appears that the two major points of contention that existed last year exist this year. One is, what is the structure and how independent will be the oversight of the state's ethics laws? And then in addition to that, how much disclosure will there be of the outside business interests of public officials? On the latter point, I think it's getting clearer, although again, we don't know for sure, in the sense that, as you mentioned earlier in the setup piece, that Speaker Silver's agreed to have a broader disclosure of outside business incomes than they had in last year's bill.
Right.
So what we're hearing is something along the lines of, if you have business before the government and you have a business relationship with an elected official, that would be disclosed. Beyond that, that there's going to be some process, and we don't know the details yet, of other outside income that would be vetted by the oversight entity, and that's why these issues are connected. So the issue then is how far do you go? So for what gets discussed a lot are lawyers.
Right.
How much of the lawyer's clients do you want to have disclosed? But then how does that apply to other people that have businesses that are not lawyers?
Okay.
And that's, I think, where it gets murkier.
Let's start with this here. I mean, in terms of attorneys, it's always this whole attorney-client privilege thing always comes up, and that is
Right.
something that lawmakers who are, in fact, lawyers have always hidden behind. In fact, I'm pretty sure it was NYPIRG recently did a spreadsheet. It's not as many as you think. Supposedly, everybody thought that, oh, the government is lousy with lawyers, but as it turns out, it's actually not that many. It's someplace in the 2 dozen range, if I remember correctly. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. There's about 45 of the 212.
Okay, so it is a significant number of people, sort of, but the real issue is that you've got at least 3, Dean Skelos, the Senate Majority Leader, the Senate Minority Leader John Sampson, and Sheldon Silver, the Speaker, all of counsel at different firms. And the real issue here is if you are representing whoever your client is, and you don't disclose it, and then you subsequently vote on something, some kind of piece of legislation, for example, and you don't disclose that, that's a conflict of interest. Plus, you're getting money from these people, and you don't know what you're doing on the back end. That's the issue exactly?
That's direct. I mean, you got it right. I mean, the problem is it gets murky. I mean, it's pretty clear that if the client has business before the government, if they're a lobbyist, if they're somebody who hires a lobbyist, if they have government contracts, those business relationships should be disclosed. But you start walking a little further away from there and it gets less clear. So if you're doing a sort of, if you're a lawyer, run-of-the-mill will or a real estate closing, do we need to know every client there? And then how do you require the disclosure of the firm's clients beyond the legislator? Sometimes the issue is, does the legislator may not be representing someone that has business before the government directly, but the firm might be. But then you have big firms that have business offices all around the world. Do we need all those clients? And so it's actually a complicated issue that people have to work through, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why we're hearing about movement now 6 weeks into the session as compared to having heard it earlier.
You know, often when you're of counsel, one of the things that you do, particularly if you're a powerful guy like Shelley Silver is, for example, or Dean Skelos, you're the rainmaker. You might bring in business
right.
just simply because you happen to have your name affiliated with the firm, and you may never go to court. So if, in fact, you say all you have to do is disclose your personal client list, that might not actually get at what some of this legislation is supposed to get at, what people hope to get at, because you'll never know who you actually brought in for business as a lawmaker.
Well, that's exactly right, and it's the same issue applies to the non-lawyers. So, for example, former Senate Majority Leader Joe Bruno had business clients He had a firm that he had created that had relationships with an investment group, and the business, the unions and businesses that had business with that group were the ones where the allegation was that Senator Bruno was gaming the system on behalf of those interests, which was never proven. But you can see how it can get complicated because you have multiple steps in between. How far can you realistically go to get the most important information? Where's the reasonable limit? And I think that's what negotiators are grappling with now.
Okay.
The wild card, of course, is we have no idea where the Senate Republicans are in this whole thing. They've only made public comments. Last year, they worked with Governor Patterson, to defeat the override. This year, they are, in fact, nowhere, as far as we can tell, in terms of a proposal.
Right. I mean, just to remind viewers, there was, in fact, an ethics reform proposal that Governor Patterson actually vetoed because he said it didn't go far enough. I mean, this other issue here is the question of disclosing the amount of your outside income. Right now, it's a very, very broad what you have to do in terms of the levels of income. You don't say, I made $99,999 last year. You say, I made somewhere between, $0 and $1 million. I mean, I'm being facetious, but it's pretty broad. The idea is to narrow this down. That's what they're talking about, not saying specifically exactly how much you actually took in. Is that right?
That's correct. I mean, last year's bill, the way it works for your viewers is there are letter grades that they give the category. So $0 to $5,000 in income is an A, $5,000 to $10,000 B, and it goes up. Last year, they did try to narrow the bands, and they required the disclosure of those letter values. Under current law, it just says XYZ Corporation, and it's blank. You don't even get the letter range disclosed. So the bill that was passed last year, my guess is that if they do anything this year, the same thing will happen, is that letter grade will be disclosed, and they are also talking about narrowing the range of how you define that outside income. How narrow, we don't know. But the current law is that the last category is anything $250,000 and above, which is a big difference. To $300,000 or $30 million is a big difference in terms of how much of a potential conflict of interest there may be.
Now, we're on the timing here. Obviously, the budget is taking the priority and really sucking a lot of the air out of the room. It might be that the governor will introduce his own program bill and try and get these guys on the record. The legislature is under no obligation to pick that up, although once it arrives, obviously, it pressures people to take some action. The other thing is, I'm surprised that I'm not hearing yet any discussion about salaries. Some people have said, you know what, ban moonlighting altogether and just increase the legislative salary, not $79,500, which is the base pay for lawmakers, but whatever it is, I don't know, $120,000, which is about the neighborhood where a New York City council person makes, and just say no outside income. That takes care of the whole kit and caboodle.
Well, and that's how the executive branch operates. Right now, the executive branch, full-time, they're not allowed to have inside income that exceeds $5,000 without the blessing of the Commission on Public Integrity. You don't have that on the legislative branch. Virtually every state, in fact, I think every state, allows outside income of some amount. And so that would be a big difference if New York State moved from that. And then secondly, the question is, in this sort of toxic fiscal environment, can you really justify to the public paying lawmakers more money, even if they don't have outside income?
Well, of course, this is not soup, as we said, and it is still developing. I want to thank you, Blair Horner, for catching up with us, and we will be back with you soon. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Blair. Appreciate it.